Guys, welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. Today we're going to talk about privacy maturity. My name's Carolyn Carver. I'm a principal consultant at Three Black Cats. We'll be recording today's session and we'll be publishing it online. It doesn't include the images or facts that you were here. It's just literally me talking and the slides. If you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A and we'll either answer them as we go or plenty of time at the end for it. So why do we worry about privacy maturity? So privacy is an indicator quite often of trust of our organisation. So therefore we may want to measure it so we know where we stand. So first up, thinking about why is that privacy an element of trust? So there is a strong correlation between if people trust your organisation to be doing the right thing, to be handling people's data in appropriate ways, they're more likely to want to continue to do business with you, or they may want to cease to do business with you if, for example, you have been subject to a major breach or have just done stuff that people are really uncomfortable or unhappy with. So therefore, it can be a strong attractor. So if you think about privacy in the electronics area, a lot of people hold up Apple, for example, as a high privacy product. Gives you lots of choices about how you manage your privacy, but it also has a lot of privacy by default in terms of not allowing app providers, etc., to do things without your consent. The counter to that is we have Google, their competitor, who may have been known at one point to say something along the lines of, you know, we make money from your data. So when you consider those two, privacy can be an attractor or a detractor in both of those cases. And last but not least, and it shouldn't usually be how you lead out your privacy program, it is a legal requirement in New Zealand to follow the Privacy Act, and that's for all organisations, big, small, voluntary, paid, etc. It is indeed compulsory for that to occur. So when we think about measuring our maturity, we think about how we want to portray that maybe to the board or the executive. Because if someone asks you, how good is our privacy? You want something to fall back onto. But also, if you're trying to improve your privacy, having metrics on it is really important to know, have you gone far enough? Where are you aiming for? And where are you now? So quite often, a privacy maturity assessment is usually a good place to start, particularly if you're going to run an uplift program, etc., to get a bit of a baseline as to where you are. So commonly used frameworks in New Zealand is the Privacy Maturity Assessment Framework called the PMAF. Now, it was developed back in 2014 for government, and it has been compulsory for Crown agencies, the larger ones, to use it right up till last year. So this is a framework based on New Zealand legislation, but it covers not only the legislative pieces, but some more of the cultural pieces, etc., that are required to have a good privacy foundation. That said, although it was developed for core government, it is absolutely fit for purpose for many organisations in New Zealand. And in fact, I personally use it for most of my clients, including commercial. There are some bits I will tailor out. So maybe if my organisation has less of a focus on Maori data, I might tailor some of that bits out, for example. But in general, it should be usable for everybody, and it's publicly available on their website. If you do a search for PMAF, you will find it. So how do we do that maturity assessment? So the actual assessment framework has got 3 levels in it. informal, foundational, and managed. And apologies, I note we have a typo on the slide. So informal means that our approach is really unstructured. Generally, we see privacy as a compliance exercise, and it's generally someone else's job, usually the privacy officers, to deal with privacy for the whole organization. Versus foundational, which means we have an organizational wide approach to privacy, but we're a bit siloed in how we do this. So we might have some really good teams and we might have some awful teams. And it tends to be happening at a sort of project level, team level, rather than a pan-organizational level. And then we have manage. So manage means that our approach is really well thought through. It's actually related to the risk profile our organization actually has. And it's built into everything we do. So I think of managed as it's part of our DNA. It's not a bolt-on. It just comes naturally to all of our staff, etc., that it is something we need to consider. Now, when I do my assessments, I also have the option of absent. Absent being we haven't even made informal. It's just completely devoid of items here. And when we do this assessment, we need to focus on evidence of what's actually happening. So one of the things we quite often see when we do these assessments is we have policies, and policies, pages of them, but nobody knows about them. Certainly nobody's following them. So actually they're of no great benefit to increasing our maturity. So we need to focus on what can we actually see, what can you evidence. So think of it like an internal audit. If you can't see it happening, it's not true, it's not been occurring. So once we have done our assessment, we then end up quite often with a graph like this. So this is the PMAF assessment. It comes out in a series of groups that we look at in terms of focus. So if we think about culture, we're talking about things like tone from the top. Do our staff recognize why it's important? Is it built into and aligned with maybe our corporate values, etc.? Things like privacy oversight. Is it just the privacy officer's job to look after privacy, or is it actually something that the senior leadership and the board, etc., are interested in and have visibility of what's going on? And then it comes around to things like access and correction, risk management, etc. And underneath each of these is broken down even further. So most of these have got sort of 3 or 4 measure points underneath. What generally you need to do is then look out, right, where are we this year? So that's our blue level. Where are we now? Where do we want to be next year? And then where do we want to be in maybe 3 years' time? So we know where that flag on the top of the hill is. And it's worth saying at this point, not every organization will be striving for managed at all. Because actually, if your risk profile is lower, foundational might be all you need for your organization, with elements of managed in certain teams, for example. Or if you are the organization who never gets a privacy request because you're a private sector agency, for example, then maybe actually you don't need that to be anywhere above sort of informal foundational, because actually it's not a risk area for you. So when you think about your privacy maturity, if you are going to compare it to other organizations, and this is a really common thing we get asked, make sure you pick an organization that has a like profile to you in terms of what you do. So comparing one council to another, quite, should be pretty aligned in what they're meant to be doing. Comparing a council to a bank they shouldn't be the same. Okay, so making sure if you are going to do that, that you pick like for like on this. And that also then comes into what is our program of work we're going to do? And are we happy with where our privacy maturity is? So if we look at this current one with that current maturity, there's most probably not a huge amount of organizations who would be happy with that current blue line. Looks like we have nobody who's accountable. Looks like our culture's a bit iffy. Most probably not going to work for many organizations. And we're saying as you try and improve your maturity, it's a logarithmic scale. So to get out of absent to informal, not much work. Formal to foundational, bit more work. Foundational to managed is a hell of a lot of work. Okay, so before we put that effort in, we need to make sure it's appropriate to spend the money in your organization on that, based on your risk profile. If you are engaging with the Privacy Commissioner, quite often this is something they might ask you about, particularly if you've had a history of talking with them over various incidents. Sometimes they will ask you, have you measured your maturity? And this is quite often a good talking point with them about what you have done. So we've done our measurement and we've realised that actually we're not maybe quite where we want to be. So we tend to think about our changes in a number of areas, and we can change these in parallel with each other, or we might do them individually. And the level of change you're going to do at any given time is proportional to your appetite of your business. There's not many organisations in New Zealand who can stop their whole business to improve their privacy maturity. It's not appropriate. Most people go out of business doing it. So we need to find a way that is proportional to the risk we're facing and as a pace that the business can cope with. So let's think about some of the changes we might want to make and talk about a few of them. So in order to have any privacy maturity change, your culture needs to be right. If your culture isn't right at your organization, you will struggle ever to get out of foundational. Even sometimes you'll struggle to even get into foundational. And the reason for that is if there is no tone from the top that privacy is important to your business, then people won't do it. They will see it as an add-on and a bolt-on and a roadblock to their progress. So in order to make any of these changes, it's really important to have that tone from the top, from your leadership team, that is actually privacy is important and we need to do this. Okay. And that might be demonstrated by, for example, your leadership team talking about privacy, your leadership team asking questions to their team about privacy. It doesn't need to be a big song and dance about it, but it needs to be clear from that top that actually this is not a corner we're going to cut. The next part about it, culturally wise, is making sure that privacy is considered to be everybody's responsibility. So if you are one of those informal organizations, you will generally find that privacy is the sole responsibility or expert of the privacy officer. Maybe we don't have one at all. Maybe it's nobody's job. But that pushing it out is then pushing out that message that privacy is everybody's job. And that's from, I noticed there was a breach, I called it out, to actually, I want to challenge my peers. So maybe I'm on a project team and I think we're over collecting information. I feel that I am empowered to go forth and challenge my peers and say, hey, I've got a privacy concern. Like, why are we collecting that? Or what are we doing with that? Do we need to do it? And one of the biggest things that would change that culture as well is moving from a compliance-based culture to an individual's culture. So from that, what I mean is, if you have a culture of the law says you must comply with the Privacy Act and it has 13 principles and you just must do it, most people are like, yeah, that's not working for me. It just feels like paperwork for paperwork's sake. Now, some organisations, depending on the sector you work in, that will be okay. So if you are in banking, for example, where there's so many laws you have to comply with, that it's the law, get on with it, will work. In other organisations, it doesn't. And that's quite a lot of organisations. So we generally need to turn the narrative round about why do we do privacy. So we need to do things like focus on the individuals. So that's bringing customer stories to life. Okay, we had this breach. This was what happened. This was the customer's experience. This is how it made them feel. This is the impact on their life. And if we can then relate privacy to people and get our staff thinking about how would I feel in that customer's shoes, generally that will move your dial quite a lot on it. As we then mature our privacy, we also quite often get to a blame culture. And it just happens naturally. The more breaches we start notifying about, as our maturity increases, and by the way, that's not a reflection of we suddenly have more breaches. That is usually a reflection of we are actually growing in maturity and can recognize one. We then sometimes end up in a blame culture. So being very clear, and this comes from that tone from the top, mistakes happen. Okay, we are on a journey, we need to improve things, and we need to learn from them. You know, absolutely though, if you have been malicious in what you have done, yes, there will be a blame culture. But if it's a true accident, let's learn from it, let's move along. I think there's a key thing here. You know, Rome wasn't built in a day. Your privacy and maturity is the same thing. It won't go from zero to hero overnight just because you want it to. So we might then need to make some governance changes as well. So every organisation, big, small, etc., is required to have at least one privacy officer. Okay, so this privacy officer or officers are the person in your organisation who's flying the privacy flag, deals with breaches, might be reviewing your PIs, not necessarily, but they are required in legislation. Now, if you don't have a privacy officer or it's not something you're wanting to develop in your organisation, that's something you are allowed to outsource. But it is something you have to have as a thing within your organisation somehow. We might also want to do things like defining roles and responsibilities. So if we think about breach, for example, as we mature, we suddenly find that we get everybody's view on whether it's a notifiable privacy breach, and we get a whole bunch of people who all think it is their job to tell the Privacy Commissioner about it. Most probably isn't going to work for your organisation like that. So maybe we need to set roles and responsibilities about who is determining, is it a privacy breach? Who is determining, is it notifiable? Who's authorised to speak to the Privacy Commissioner, who is not? I'm being very clear on them. We might also want to start doing some reporting up to our boards. So, for example, our board's like, well, you know, you're spending this money on privacy, what have we got to show for it? So we might want to do reporting on things like this percentage of our staff have taken privacy training this year. Here are the number of breaches we're having per month, and this is how many are serious harm. Now, as I said earlier, just watch with breach reporting to make sure it's got the right narrative, because a huge spike in breaches being reported does not equal more breaches. What it usually equals is you did your privacy training the week before and everyone's super acutely aware and reports lots. So just making sure that you have the right narrative with that. Equally, a drop off in privacy breach reporting quite often means that it's time to redo your privacy training for your staff. We might want to report on the number of PIAs being completed. However, most probably less so than the number of PIAs, we might want to report on the risks that have been identified in those PIAs and what's been done with them, because that's actually the most important piece, not how many we did. And in some organisations, we might want to set up things like a privacy working group or a privacy champions network. And that is a team of people from different disciplines who are going to help the privacy officer improve the privacy maturity. So it might have people like security, records management, official information, customer services, those sort of people on it, legal, procurement, who are all going to work together as a group to get this privacy maturity to increase. And that is because, as I said earlier, privacy is not the sole responsibility of the privacy officer. Same comes with maturity uplift. It can't be solely done by the privacy officer. So they need a team to help with it. And then coming on, key things we need to do, training. So in order to increase your privacy maturity, training for all staff is really important. Now, this doesn't need to be complicated training. We don't need them to all become a privacy officer. It might be something like a 20-minute module on what's required under the Privacy Act, but in terms of life cycle. So, you know, when you get stuff from people, we need to tell them what we're doing. That kind of level training. And it's really advised to have that rolled out to all staff. So that might go in your online learning platform, or it may be something you hold as a presentation once a year for your staff. I wouldn't suggest doing it more than once a year if it's the same module time and time again, because people get blasé and they click through it. The other thing is make sure it's interactive. It's got things like quizzes and activities in it. Otherwise, people drop off to sleep and just click next, next, next. Okay. So think about what works for training for your organisation. It will, again, vary depending on the type of organisation you are. Okay, there's no point in rolling out a training module quite often in some retail organisations where their staff don't have a computer. Not helpful. How are they ever going to do it? They won't. So we need to think about other methods for it. So talking about other methods, we might roll out things like a SharePoint site about privacy at our organisation. And that's somewhere for us to put top hints and tips for people about how to do privacy. Maybe we've got a page on there about what to do in the event of a breach. We've got one about how to do privacy assessments, what to do if someone contacts us wanting a copy of their information. Some people also run, you know, interesting tidbits from the news, what's been going on in privacy, what have other organisations done that we want to learn from, etc. Go on that side. And again, remembering our audience for that, making sure it's plain language, understandable by all of your staff. Thinking about over a year, we don't want to do training just once a year. So we need to actually bring it throughout the year. So a couple of things we can do. We have Privacy Week once a year. That is your opportunity to really promote privacy at your organisation. So maybe it's having activities, quizzes, prizes for morning tea, for anything like that. All help promote privacy and actually bring it to the forefront in your organisation. And that's another opportunity for that demonstration of tone from the top during that week to be like, yep, you know, we're celebrating Privacy Week, CEO is, and this is why it's important to him or her. And then we might want to do bespoke training for specific teams. So this might be training for your contact center about how to identify a customer correctly. Or it might be training for, say, front-facing retail staff, that's specific messaging that we need them to do. And that training might also come with things like posters. Okay, so if you have a constant breach where people leave their printing on the printer and walk away, having a simple poster by the printer of something like, please check you've only got your own printing, can make a huge difference. Okay, or when you are finished with your paper, please shred it in the bin that we put it here. Don't just randomly throw it in any old bin we've got. So just simple things, they're not very expensive, can make quite a big change in your organisation. So operationally, what might we need to change? So we need to think about things like our privacy statements. We spoke earlier in the week about this being our view of what we are doing with personal information in our organisation. And we have a legal requirement under Information Privacy Principle 3 to have one of these things. So maybe we need to actually review it. In some cases, maybe we need to write it, full stop. In other cases, we might find ours is called our privacy policy, and we've realised it now should be called our privacy statement or notice. Maybe we need to do that. And it's good form, by the way, to review this at least once a year and make sure it is actually accurate. We might also want to do things about reducing our collection practices. So we might want to review our forms that we use for filling in for services and actually go through and go, no, we don't need that information. Let's stop collecting it. Okay. Less information you have in, less we have to deal with in terms of privacy requests, breaches, retention, disposal, etc. So the best privacy reduction we can do in risk is not to collect it in the first place. Coming in for May, we need to think about how we're going to deal with giving our privacy statement or notice where we have collected information indirectly. So we might need to be thinking this year, particularly for our privacy program, how are we going to start and do that? I mentioned earlier things around customer identification. Quite often we discover that when we look at your privacy maturity, and particularly when we look at breaches, a number of them are quite often caused by confusion as to who the customer actually is. So by that, I mean, we either didn't know who they were when we signed them up originally, or when we interact with them on the phone or by email, we're not sure who they are, but we still tell them what they want, ending in a privacy breach. So maybe we need to do some changes around customer identification upfront and ongoingly. Someone mentioned earlier in the week as well about things like comments in Teams, and did we have to provide them as part of a Privacy Act request? And we talked about, yes, that was indeed part of a Privacy Act request. So we might need to think about rolling out some changes and some training and some guidance about how to keep records about people who've contacted us. So what is appropriate to write in customer notes? What is not appropriate? Bearing in mind, as we improve our privacy maturity, we might have more people ask for a copy of their notes. So we don't want to be the person who's trying to explain why they wrote the customer is delusional or something equally as offensive in the customer notes. Okay. And then the last piece we quite often come across in this operational area is things around consents. So that might be marketing consents for your organisation. So maybe you have been asking people, do you want to receive marketing from us? And they've said no, and then we continue to market to them. Or we might market to them not by email, but instead we might keep giving them Facebook ads or other such things. But we're also seeing consents in the area of things like AI. Are you okay for your data to be used for training of our AI or for maybe medical research, and actually making sure that we honour those consents and people have the right to be able to change them as well if they want. And quite often that's that next step up in maturity about how do we want to manage our data rather than in bulk, actually letting people have that level of autonomy about how they want their data managed by us. Now, you note I've left policy changes to a bit later in this presentation, and that was exceptionally intentional. Quite often when we start with wanting our privacy to mature, we decide we'll write a whole bunch of policies. In fact, lots of you will have a whole bunch of policies. However, policies won't work unless you have done some of that other stuff first. So unless you have the tone from the top and you have a culture which involves reading the policy and engaging with it, if not, all you've got is a lot of paper that tells people how to do stuff that they're not reading. So once we have convinced people that privacy is something that they have to engage with and they want to engage with, then thinking about our privacy policy, so different to our statement and notice. This is about our policy about how we want privacy to work in our organisation. So it might include things about how do we onboard vendors? What do we need to do? When we're talking about that vendor risk management yesterday. When do we need a PIA? How do we do one? What do we do if about retention and disposal? So we might have it a link out to our retention and disposal policy and schedule. What do we do if someone wants a copy of their information, etc.? So that's where all of that stuff goes. We then generally have a breach policy. Now that breach policy may be standalone for privacy, or it may be more appropriate for it to be incorporated into other breach policies or incident policies in your organisation. So it might not need to be standalone. So if you've already got an incident policy that's wide enough, maybe that can go in there. Okay, or a security incident policy. Maybe it can be included in security and privacy. Depending on the size of your organisation and the number of privacy requests you get, maybe you want a policy about how to manage privacy requests. If you are getting one and never, I wouldn't bother writing a policy about it because you're never going to use it. I would just have a talk to the privacy officer if you get one of these kind of policy. Equally, if you are getting loads of law enforcement requests, so if you are that organisations who are getting police, customs, immigration coming to you and asking for information under the exceptions for disclosure, then you might want a policy about when in your organisation can you voluntarily release information or not. And the key word there is voluntary. If there is a court order, there is no choice, right? Get on with it, do it. If it's mandated by their legislation, again, once you've established to your satisfaction it's mandatory, get on and do it. However, a lot of those law enforcement requests will be voluntary, which means your organisation needs to decide are you going to do it or not. Thinking about our projects. So most organizations have many projects on the go at once. Thinking about how do we embed, as we talked about yesterday, privacy by design into those projects. So is that we're going to run a privacy by design training session for people? Are we going to issue some of those pattern books we talked about yesterday about good and bad privacy design? Are we going to build a checklist for privacy by design in? Could be any or all of these. And then one of our biggest step changes, if you haven't already got it, is rolling out our privacy impact assessments and privacy threshold assessments. And that is about bringing those privacy risks to the forefront so they're understood in your business. However, You can't roll out those privacy impact assessments and thresholds usually until there is at least a base level of understanding of what is privacy and what's required. And the reason for that, particularly if you've got the Word form versions of it, is sometimes that is too hard for them to complete. If you have one of the multi-choice written in plain language versions of PIAs, you can generally roll those out earlier in the program. And then thinking about how do we make sure the projects and the business actually manage their privacy risks. So this is all good. All these changes mean that we're now looking at things and we know we've got some problems. That next step change in maturity is getting the business to own those problems. An informal privacy maturity organisation, they'll be sure that the privacy officer owns all this risk and is going to make it go away for them. In a more managed organisation, there is a whole of business ownership of these changes and an understanding that they will all have to participate in changing it. Because it might be, if we think about our contact centre, for example, it might be that we need training to our staff on how to do call management. We might need QA processes, etc. That's not something in the privacy officer's direct control, so they will need that cohort of colleagues to help them push that change through. And then last but not least, we might need to think about what we do about our third parties. So we might need to think about making some policy decisions as an organisation about, will we let our vendors or third parties use our data for their own purposes? A lot of organisations make the decision no. And the reason they make the decision no is that if they allow them to use it, there is a lot more emphasis on making sure it's anonymous and making sure that that line between acting for your organisation and it being for their own use is not blurred over. Okay, so lower maturity organisations be like, no, it's hard and fast. No, we're not going to do this. We might want to think about our way we contract. So quite often we will review as part of maturity uplift, maybe our standard terms and conditions if we have a set for our organisation, and make sure that we put in any privacy ones we might need. So I'm thinking about that clause that says, and if you have a breach, you need to tell us, or we want to have your security controls be at this minimum standard. You might also, if you are dealing with third parties who provide their own contracts, want to make a checklist to go through and go, you need to make sure you have ticked off all of these and therefore are sure that that contract gives us enough cover. And then a lot further on in our maturity program is quite often the idea of starting up third-party assurance programs. So making sure our vendors are doing what they said they were doing and that we are happy with what they're doing. Generally, I wouldn't start that work until I was sure my own house was in order. So generally that is sort of a year 3 thing. If I've got maybe 1 or 2 really high risk vendors where half my data's with them, I might start it for just those 2 vendors, but I definitely wouldn't start it across mass number of vendors until my own house was in order first, should I say. And that's solely because at the end of the day, you have a lot more influence over your internal stuff than you do your vendors, unfortunately. So therefore, maybe we practice our skills internally first. So how do we prioritize these things? Now, like I said, Rome wasn't built in a day. You are not going to go from non-existent privacy to completely managed this year. It's not going to happen. So we need to think about prioritizing stuff so that we can do this work in a managed fashion. Okay, so we need to set reasonable targets on that. So that might be when we look back at that graph, we think about what are we going to change this year? Okay, what can we actually change this year? So when we look at our work program, we might say, actually, well, we know we can't change our risk management until we've actually addressed our culture. So maybe our first 6 months, we're going to work on culture and training and tone from the top. That's all we're going to do. We're not going to change anything else. We're just going to do that, because that will then give us the foundational baseboards that we can then leap off to do those next changes up. Okay. But most probably you're not going to set out to go, well, take everything from either absent or informal all up to foundational. You'll want to pick your points on that diagram to go, we'll push this one and this one in this order. Okay. And absolutely, I would focus on that culture, training, tone, governance first. And that is because without that, all of the other uplift becomes excessively harder than it needs to be. Once you've got that culture, etc., right, it is a lot easier to push off it to do that. That said, there is a suggestion that you focus on things that are outwardly facing as well at the same time. So if somebody is going to complain about your privacy to the Privacy Commissioner, they're most probably not going to complain about your over-attention, which, let's be honest, all of us on this call will be doing, because it's part of being a New Zealand culture of hoarding things. Most of our customers are not going to complain to the Privacy Commissioner about that. What they are going to complain about, though, is things like there is no privacy statement, or the privacy statement doesn't relate to what you're actually doing with my data, or I had a privacy request and you didn't answer it and you just completely ignored me. Okay, so making sure what I would call the shop frontage of your organization looks like a mature privacy organization. So I can find your privacy statement. It actually reflects your business. I kid you not, the number I see that appear to not even be that business's privacy statement and appear to relate to someone in a different sector even is scary. And then making sure, there is an email for privacy or an address to make a question or complaint to. Those sort of things. Also then, if the Privacy Commissioner needs to talk to you about something, because they don't have a requirement in New Zealand to register, then they can find how to contact your privacy team. So they can find your privacy statement. It says, hey, if you want to contact privacy to talk about something, here is the email address. Okay. It will irk them even further if they have to play hunt the privacy officer in your organization. So just having that little step can make a big difference. And I think, to reiterate to you, it is not a privacy officer's only responsibility to get your privacy to mature. They might be the figurehead, they might lead the program and work out what needs to happen, but they are not solely responsible for doing it. So as an example, if one of your areas of lack of maturity is records retention and deletion, and you have a records management team, then I would absolutely be assigning that step change in maturity to that team. I wouldn't be trying to lead it out as the privacy officer. Again, if your security controls are not up to par, get the security team involved, get them to lead that work for you, etc. So think about how can you share that load across your organization. And that also comes with a bit of a thought about how are you going to structure your uplift. So whilst doing your uplift, you will still have to do your BAU as a privacy team. Now, if you are sitting at informal, your BAU workload at the moment is most probably pretty low. You're not doing any PIAs, hardly anyone tells you about breach, and that is quite quiet for privacy. However, once you roll out things like breaches, breach reporting, and PIAs, you will find that you become quite popular. Now, that's great. It means your maturity is increasing, but you need to consider how do you do that in parallel to actually doing your uplift as well? Because if people come to your team and are like, hey, I've got a project, I've done my first ever PIA, I'm so excited, and you're like, cool lads, but I'm really busy, I'll look at it in like 8 weeks, they're not going to do another one. So we need to think about making sure that you've got enough bandwidth set aside as well to start and do that, what will become your BAU role. Okay, so the way some people do this, they might split off their privacy maturity team who are working on making changes from their BAU team. They might say, actually, we're going to work on BAU some days of the week and we're going to work on uplift the others. Okay, but just making sure you have planned and thought about that, but also that you don't roll out breach notifications on Monday and PIAs on Tuesday and retention and disposal on Wednesday, because they've all been planned by different teams, and suddenly your workload has gone through the roof as the privacy officer. So just thinking about that flow on from everything you roll out from maturity uplift should flow back to you in some way, shape or form as BAU work potentially. So how do you cater for that uplift? Perfect. So that gives us some idea of where we might go from maturity uplift. Feel free to pop any questions in the Q&A and we will come back to them.